Hi everyone, this is beautiful Becca. Once again, we have a wonderful, I cannot believe that I actually heard back from this author, but I am so excited. Today we have, Avi is in the house. If anyone has ever read Crispin and the Cross of Lead, it's by Newbery award-winning author, simply known as Avi. I wrote to him, and I wrote to a few other authors as well, including librarians and a few book club leaders, and I'm hoping to hear back from a few more. But it was a wonderful experience having him on Becca's Book Talks today. We had a lot to talk about. There was some technical difficulties at the beginning, but we got it done, and I loved our conversation. So for those of you who are new to Becca's Book Talks, it is where I basically set up a questionnaire, a set questionnaire of set questions, and sometimes for authors in particular, because of their published works, I will have some follow-up questions. What I may want to do for future is to specifically have some extra questions for authors based on their published works. But the set question is there as like a base so that we get to discuss kind of like what a lot of people are sharing their same thoughts on, and each one has a different response. But it was I loved today's interview with Avi in particular. So those of you who are new to my channel, I am known as Beautiful Becca. My interviews with authors, librarians, and hopefully one day, celebrities who are avid readers. I have written to a few, so we'll see what happens. But I enjoyed the one-on-one conversation with these wonderful influencers. So if you're new to my channel, hello and welcome. Don't forget to click like and subscribe to my channel to have a lot more interviews to come, to see new art projects that I'm currently working on. So if you wish to know what happened in today's conversation, grab a pen, grab your quill, grab a notepad, and get ready to write down with me. So, Avi, welcome.
Well, we made it.
Yeah, we did. All right. So everyone, so for everyone who is new to this podcast, this is Becca's Book Talks, and I have interview with author Avi. He is a Newbery award-winning author, and I'm a big fan of his books. And Avi recently, this last couple of months, I've actually read about, I want to say between 6 to 7 of the books that I never read before. Hi, Linda.
Hi.
Awesome. All right. So, Avi, did you get a chance to look over the questionnaire?
Yeah, I don't know how well I can answer them, but
That's okay.
I'll try.
That's awesome. Okay. So, because you are an author, what are the top 10 books, if you can name 10 or maybe just even a few, that have influenced your life and in your profession, whether it be personal narratives or stories that have left a lasting impression on you, and why?
I was an early reader and was read to a lot by when I was an infant. So there was a crowd of picture books and so forth. Very quickly, I began to read chapter books. I don't know how old I was, but these the first book, I could give you a long list of picture books I remember. They're quite extraordinary that I do, but I do. And then I began to read an American writer called Thornton W. Burgess. And Thornton W. Burgess wrote animal stories, and they were serialized in newspapers. And they were in New York newspapers where I grew up. And I read these, but I could also get them as books, and I could get them very, very cheaply at a used bookstore. And these stories I loved. It's as simple as that. And I read a lot of them. And then I went on to the Freddie the Pig books. And then what did I and then I read I was growing up in the 40s, 1940s. And in those days, children's books were radically different than they are today. And so what I would read is lots of what they would call boys' books, the Hardy Boys, Tom Swift. And not coincidentally, and it's important in this discussion, what I was listening was children's radio. And children's radio had enormous impact on me. I listened every day. These were serialized stories, everything from Batman to Superman. And I can give you a long list of these. If you read one of my books called Who Was That Masked Man Anyway, which is about kids listening to the radio and trying to enact this. And I have a memory of with a cousin of mine who lived in the neighborhood, and I would enact adventure stories with him as if they were radio shows, you know. Then I would say things like, okay, you say this, let's go get him. And okay, we get him, and so forth. And these were sort of invented, but they were narratives. And this had a huge influence on me. And that book, Who Was That Masked Man Anyway, which I think is my funniest book, by the way, tries to encapsulate that kind of experience. Anyway, so I was reading all these so-called boys' books, Tom Swift, Hardy Boys, what have you, cowboy stories. And at some point, I discovered Treasure Island, Robbie Louis Stevenson, and that had a huge impact on me. But I was also reading books like The Wind in the Willows, a huge, huge book for me. Anyway, and then from then I had free reign in the local public library. I could go whenever I wanted. I could walk there. There was no censorship in any sense of the word from my parents or the library. The library, I was only allowed to go to the children's book section. That's the way they ran it that day. And it wasn't very big. But the point is, I could get and did read anything I wanted. And then there were bookstores in my neighborhood, particularly a used bookstore. Then, and if you go way in the back in these sort of dim, dusty recesses, I could buy books for 25 cents each.
The day.
and did, and had my own library, if you will. And then I'm just reading, so it's impossible for me to tell you which books, but I just read a great deal. As a young adult, at some point I began to read history and historical novels. An American writer named Kenneth Roberts wrote historical fiction that somehow I attached myself to. But I was reading history. At some point as a teenager, I joined the History Book of the Month Club or something like that. And I would get books that way. I still have a couple of them. And what else was I reading? I mean, I read everything and anything. And at some point, I discovered Hemingway, important writer for me as a young man, and Dashiell Hammett, the crime writer who invented noir fiction in some ways, The Maltese Falcon.
Okay. Maltese Falcon. Okay, got that one.
And I was hugely impressed by that. Another book, Catch You Later, Traitor, I describe, again, the radio experience, but also trying to encapsulate how I dealt with this noir fiction. It wasn't as if I liked the murders and the sort of erotic aspects of it. I love the language of it, the sharpness of it, the crispness of it. And now and again, I still read them, Raymond Chandler and the like, MacDonald. And again, and then I discovered a French detective writer named Simenon, and of course Hemingway, and these are all writers who wrote extremely crisp dialogue, very impressive to me. At the same time, I was reading Dickens. Now, this is totally the opposite. Great Expectations is, in my canon, one of the great books. And it may sound super sentimental, but I read A Christmas Carol every Christmas, and it always
Hey.
moves me. It always moves me.
Oh, yeah.
And my wife will often say, "Why is it? What makes you tear up for that book year after year?" I wish I knew the answer. I don't know. It's
Like do you consider it like a seasonal thing? Every
no, it's
Christmas,
not.
just like a
It's a moral lesson that I take very much to heart, in a sense that I could be a better person. Well, certainly Scrooge could, but I don't think I'm in the same league of meanness that he is. But it's this sort of feeling that I could be better and I better do something about it. I don't know what it is, but anyway, I read it every year. So those are some of the books that had great impact on me as a young man. And then I just read anything and everything. I read a lot of history, and then my early career focus was not writing novels, but plays. I wanted to be a playwright. And living in New York City as I did, theater is very important there.
mm-hmm.
And it was also cheap, relatively speaking. And I could go to the theater, and did, with some frequency. And one of the things I did is I go to a theater, and they'd have an intermission, say between act 1 and 2. And in those days, people would come outside of the theater into the lobby, into the street to smoke.
Mm-hmm.
And I would mingle with them and go back in with them. And of course, I wouldn't be asked for a ticket then, but I could easily locate seats that were not occupied or stand. And I would go see theater that way. So I stole into the theater. Anyway, those are some of those early influences on me.
And I understand because I still have, I think, maybe 7 or 8 of your books still checked out from the library. One of them, I believe, is a play, something to tell you the truth, I think it's called.
Nothing But the Truth?
Nothing but the truth, yes.
Well, it's not really a play. It's a book. It's called a documentary novel.
Yes.
And it's connected to the theater in a kind of roundabout way. There was a form of theater in the period of time of what we call the Great Depression. They were called living newspapers. And these were plays, but they were teaching plays. And particularly politics of the day. And for some reason, they really interested me. And I even tried to write one at one time. But so the form really intrigued me. And one day I found in a flea market, in a boxed game that was a mystery. And when you open the box, you found all this evidence, police reports. I remember one of them had in a little packet a cigarette stub, so you could go sift through all these documents and evidence to solve the mystery. It was really clever. Anyway, and then I came across the same thing as a printed book. In other words, they replicated these documents in a printed book. And I said, oh, you could do it this way. And that's the origin of Nothing But the Truth. It provides you with the evidence to tell you what's going on in this story. My voice is totally taken out. And it's a very popular book, and must seem old-fashioned to some people, but there's nothing like it that I know of.
Huh. I've never heard of that one. The way that you describe it when you were talking about the living newspapers as TV plays, it reminds me very much of something I read, just a brief little note on like during the early days of the medieval ages, how they would put on these I think they were called the Christian or the moral plays.
Yeah,
And
right.
they would travel from town to town to make sure people were following, the steps of God and make sure that they were
The morality plays.
morality, yeah.
And yeah, they would enact Bible stories. Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, I'll need to look more into the living newspapers, huh? So, you said that, okay, so you have a few books that you told of note here. So you have Treasure Island, you have Hemingway, you have um Great Expectations by Dickens. But of those books that you mentioned, which one would you recommend would be like the absolute number one for today's readers if you had your choice? Which one do you think would be more?
Treasure Island is still quite extraordinary. It's nothing quite like it, and it's still wonderful. So,
And what about that book that gave you the biggest inspiration? What was it about that book that just sort of like changed you or like had a big influence? What was in it?
I don't know if there's any one book. If you're a reader, and I'm sure you are, it's very hard to pick one book. At least I pick one. Growing up, it's still true. I would read a book and get very excited by it, and then go on to read another one and get excited by that one. So I would be very reluctant to pick one. I mean, I do mention A Christmas Carol that I read every year. There's no other book I do that. And it's quite perfect. I marvel at the language and its brilliance of character and so forth. So if I had to choose one, I guess I'd choose that one. So A Christmas Carol.
Nice. And what was the last story you read? And what are your thoughts and or your takeaways from that particular read?
Well, at this particular time, I'm not reading so much fiction as I am doing research for a book I'm working on, and that deals with an aspect of Colorado history. So, but I am reading Stegner's Angle of Repose, but I'm mostly reading historical documentation of something I'm writing. So I don't think other people would follow that line of reading. So
Colorado history, interesting. So are you besides taking on this new project of yours, are you taking part in any kind of reading challenge with your local library or group or another type of challenge at the present time?
I've never joined a writing group. I've never joined anything of that kind that you're alluding to. It's just something I've never done. So,
because when I started teaching in 2016, I don't even know how this happened. I was researching on like reading challenges because I was teaching English to my high school students at the time, and then I later taught visual arts to them. But I was thinking, because these kids, these students, they needed more of like a higher readers comprehension. So I was hoping to, as a side thing would be to get them reading more with a type of like reward, but they would have these questions that appeal to the book task. So right now, it's really hard for me to keep trackers, but I'm like, I have Goodreads, but the one I'm taking part in as of 2016, all this time, was the Pop Sugar Reading Challenge. And one of those challenges, and I forgot the name of the prompt, but can you see this?
Right.
This
Yeah.
is like my number one absolute fave. I use this all the time on the Pop Sugar Reading Challenge. It is so witty, and I mentioned it in an earlier video of the 2023 challenge. A beginning, a muddle, and an end. Did you ever? Because I think it says at the beginning here. You said, yeah. I'm on the many wise. Let's see. One of your young readers wrote to me about writing. The many wise things you said was a good story consists of a beginning, a muddle, and an end.
I love that.
Yeah, the smartest description of a story I've ever read, and I wish I knew his name. Did you ever did you recall him at all?
I think it was a young woman, but a girl. But no, I don't.
Her name, sorry.
I don't know who it was. I wish I did.
But this would be like, I was just gonna say, for anyone who wanted to aspire to start writing their own stories, they should definitely check this one out. This is like my number one favorite of yours. So
thank you.
So okay, so speaking of readers today, this is the next question, and you can delve a little bit more into this one. What do you believe is the biggest obstacle that is facing our readers today in the wake of the current banned or challenged book lists from like the last year? Because a lot of these books I was so surprised, because some of these books that I was actually to read these in high school and college, but like, considering students and teachers, the libraries, public libraries, and bookstore clientele, what do you think is the biggest obstacle facing them?
Well, we're living in a political environment that is, for me, rather frightening, because we have a resurgence of censorship. I mean, I just read in today's news that in some class somewhere, it was an art class, and the students were shown a picture of Michelangelo's statue of David. And a parent called in and said, this is pornographic. I mean, this is one of the great art objects in Western culture. And the principal had to resign and so forth. I mean, it's really sad. And it's as if, I think my thinking about this is that parents are frightened of their own children. They're frightened in the sense of what they are learning, what they are saying. Kids have this great capacity to see the truth and reveal the truth. And I think that frightens parents. And they're trying to repress their own kids. That's the way I think of it. Repress. And the politicians, the right-wing politicians, have bought into this and trying to empower these frightened parents. And it's sad. It's really sad.
Yeah. Because one of the books I remember reading, this book is on the challenged list for the challenge, but it's called The Kite Runner. I don't know if you've ever read that one by Khaled Hosseini.
I know of it. I've not read it.
Okay. But the other one that was on the challenge list, and it threw me for a loop, Mouse by Art Spiegelman.
Right. That's shocking to me.
Because I never really read a graphic novel before, and that was my first. And then the other one I read the year before that was supposed to be turned into a movie was called White Bird by R.J. Palacio.
I don't know that one.
It's a beautifully illustrated novel.
Right.
But what I love about it was that in the back it has these historical notes and bibliographical history that applies to that. But it was so wonderful,
it also leads to a certain form of self-censorship. I wrote a book last year, published a book called Loyalty.
Yes, I have that one. I've yet to read that.
And it's about the American Revolution. And it deals with the complexity of the American Revolution. As we sometimes think of it as in rather simplistic terms. It's not unusual, it's not uncommon. National narratives often have that kind of simplicity. Anyway, this is not simple, and I thought of a sequel to it, but the sequel that I saw had to do with race and contradictions in our own mythic history of America. And I said, I can't write that in this day. It would be attacked. It would be so. There was a self-censorship involved. I chose not to write it, and because it would be like running into a buzzsaw. So that also happens. We don't talk about that often, but that's a result of all this kind of censorship and fear mongering.
That's interesting. I never thought about it that way. Self-censorship. Huh. But will you consider writing a sequel to it anyway? If you could.
I thought of the perfect one and the logical one that would flow out of that book, and that's the one I'm not going to write. There's no way I'd undertake it. I mean, there's not just the subject matter, which dealt with race, but the kind of research I'd have to do. It was too large an undertaking for me to pursue. So I'm not.
Okay. All right. No. That could change along the way. But speaking of the banned challenge books, were there any that you already read? And why do you think those books would need to be brought back?
Well,
I'm not sure if you had a chance to look at the list.
Well, there's so many. I've read some of them. I can't pop into my mind, but when you start going down these lists, they're extraordinary. I mean, you mentioned Mouse, for example. I love those books. They're quite extraordinary, and it's a shame.
Yeah.
I mean, banning books creates ignorance. It's as simple as that. And we're going to raise our young people up as ignorant about their lives and their history and so forth. It's really tragic.
Yeah, I think we need the spirit of Ray Bradbury to come back in.
Okay, there you
go. Was there ever a story or a narrative that was a challenge for you to complete or to read through due to the nature or the content or the subject matter at any time?
Well, a book like Catch You Later, Traitor, which have elements of my own life in there. There's some writers who, excuse me.
Okay.
Some writers very much use their own life's experience, very specific aspects of their lives. I tend not to do that. That book I did, and I found it difficult to write because it was about my family, but it wasn't about my family, if that makes any sense. But I used elements of that.
Elements, yeah.
And I found it difficult to do that. So I seem to be much more comfortable with a totally invented story rather than something based on my own life.
Yeah, I understand that Dickens had a hard time. I was watching one of my favorite one of my favorite live shows is Simon Cowell's The Mystery of Charles Dickens. I don't know if you ever saw that.
I saw it on stage, actually.
Awesome. You're lucky. I would have loved to have seen him in person for that. But I understand that he comes to the point where Dickens is talking about David Copperfield. So here's Charles Dickens over here. There's David Copperfield over here. They're staring at each other face to face. Which one do you think will blink first? So his friend said, "Don't look back." But he says, what does he do? He ends up using his life. Right. And David Copperfield is considered a semi-autobiography.
Right. Well, no, but there's a book I wrote called Traitor's Gate.
Traitor's Gate?
Traitor's Gate. It's a reference to the Tower of London.
Got it.
And its inspiration is Dickens' life. And it's sort of my attempt to write a Dickens novel.
Well, that's interesting, though, because the book, I literally just finished the story last night, and now I want to find out from you if it's a dual, and I got the wrong book. Darn it. I have Redemption at Hacksaw Ridge. I'm sorry. It's called you wrote this back in it was published in 96, Beyond the Western Sea.
Correct.
And I think you and Stephen King are the only ones I've read so far where it mentions something at the beginning where you wrote it as if it was published or released
Oh,
as serials
well,
or something, right? The way that
correct.
Dickens did it.
That's correct. And the novel, which is there are 2 volumes to it. It's really one book, but the publisher and I went along with it, issued it as 2 books.
Okay.
But because it was so long, I decided that the way to write it was very short chapters with a cliffhanger at almost every
Yes.
chapter.
Yes.
And then I was going to extend it even beyond that. But what I did write, but again, I never did that. But yeah, that was as if it were a serial novel. Yeah.
Because I mean, I just became so emotional. This is of the books that I've read, this one particular, I was so emotionally. Oh, shoot. It's going to say I'm going to end in 10 minutes. So we have 10 more minutes. Yeah, I need to upgrade this silly thing. This is silly. This is what comes up. It gives me only 10 more minutes to go. So let's see if we can wrap this up. But I just wanted to say, I was saying that I became so emotionally invested in each of these, in the 3 children. I'm like, oh my God, what more could these children possibly go through? And it's like what Dickens was doing with Oliver Twist, where you have a child that is sent into the thrust of this adult world where they are
Correct.
facing the unknown. But
Right.
these ones were so, the descriptions of what happens to these children, especially little Lawrence. I'm like, oh, for crying out loud. There were times I wanted to leap out of my seat.
That sounds good.
So, which book in your entire collection that you have right now could you not live without, and why? And why does that book hold special meaning? I know you can't narrow it down to one, but I mean, again, Treasure Island, Great Expectations.
Wind in the Willows is an extraordinary book, I think. It's there was some level, I don't know, I was a city kid, and Wind in the Willows is very much not a city story. It takes place in rural England. But the characters are so extraordinarily endearing. And the character of Mr. Toad.
Yes.
What's extraordinary about that character, he's an awful creature. He's vain. He's impetuous. He doesn't treat people very well, but he's also lovable.
Yes,
And
he is.
I have read that many times. How did Kenneth Grahame do that? And
That's right, Kenneth Grahame.
It's quite extraordinary. And then it's curious. Recently I read a biography of Kenneth Grahame, and it sounds weird to say, I was so disappointed in his life. It had nothing. It's almost I was found it difficult to understand what was his connection to this extraordinary book that he wrote. He was not a very nice person. And the book is quite so wonderful. I don't quite fully understand it, how you do that. But I never want to read another thing about his life again. But I still love the book. So
yeah. Are there any organizations, charities, or special events that are taking place our viewers should look into right now that you know of or donate or participate in?
I'm not a joiner. I'm not a.
Oh, that's right. You're not a group play.
So
but,
I don't do that sort of thing. I just don't. I should, but I don't.
So there were just a couple of follow-up questions. If we do have some time, we got another 6 minutes. So I was going to mention the books that I read as of this last month. Maybe you can just delve a little bit into the inspiration just briefly. I read The Seer of Shadows, which I thought at first it had to do with postmortem photography. Then the other one was Don't You Know There's a War On? The School of the Dead, The Book Without Words, and of course the one I just read, Beyond the Western Sea. What was a brief, if you can just briefly explain, what was the inspiration behind each of those ones in particular?
School of the Dead was I visited a private school in San Francisco that was a converted mansion, Victorian mansion, and they had turned it into a modern school. And I kept thinking, what a perfect setting for a ghost story. So that's easy. Seer of Shadows, there was a time I was really invested in photography. This is before digital cameras. I had a dark room, and the whole process of taking pictures with chemistry and light I found fascinating. And to take some of those elements and create a kind of ghost story with all of that. And that's what that book is and how it came to be. So my interest in photography. I don't know, the other one you mentioned, what was that?
Don't You Know There's a War On?
Oh, Don't You Know There's a War On? One of my kids came home from school, elementary school, and said, what am I going to do? I have to find somebody who was alive during World War II and interview him. And I said, you could interview me. I was alive in World War II. You know, how kids don't quite grasp their parents' age and so forth. And in a sense, it was that question, and I began to talk to him about it. And out of that, I realized I had something I could turn into a story, and that's what that one is.
Nice. And the other, so the other one was The Book Without Words and Beyond the Western Sea. How do those stories stem?
The Book Without Words is the first book I wrote after I won my Newbery Award. And it was one of the most difficult books to write because I won that Newbery Award. I felt so much pressure to create something as good and successful. It was neither as good or as successful, but it just was difficult. And yet at the same time, I had this idea of writing a story about magic and alchemy. It's a fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, then it became fun to write. That's all. Sometimes you just write something because it's fun. So
yeah.
Okay.
And then Beyond the Western Sea.
I have sons named Sean and Kevin, so you might guess that I've had an interest in Irish culture and history, and knew something about it in the Great Famine and how people immigrated to America and so forth and so on. And just all of that coalesced into the idea I could write a story about all that great migration, the famine in Ireland and coming to America and so forth and so on. So.
All right, so we have 3 more minutes left. There's just a couple of questions I have left for you. So in some of, I noticed that like none of the books that I've read so far, but when it comes to young adult historical fiction, which you seem to have a big passion for, is it a rule for a young adult historical fiction writers, depending on, I guess, the subject matter, do you find it necessary to leave out a bibliography of the research that you did? Because I think in Loyalty or Sophia's War, you have a glossary and maybe a bibliography, but for the most of them that I've read so far, there isn't a bibliography.
I don't know. Sometimes I do that. Sometimes I don't. The glossary, that one, Sophia's War, I used. I just got interested in colonial language and used a lot of terms from that, and they fascinated me. So I thought it would be fun to put a glossary in the back of the book or something like that. You know, I'm really a quirky writer. I do, the books are different one from the other, and I don't have a way of writing or putting together a book. Each one is different, and I think of it as different. So I try not to repeat myself.
And I was just going to ask you, the writers, what I like for you in particular. I just read Lisa C. She's also interested in doing an interview. And she happened to mention her writing routine. Is there a writing routine that you have, or like has it changed from the time you started to where you are now?
Well, when I began, it was on a manual typewriter, right? And makes a big difference working on a computer and working on a manual typewriter. Has it changed? I hope so. I hope so. My books are longer. I think they're better. But that's a reader's judgment. Um, has my process changed? Well, because I'm working on a computer, it's so much easier to revise. I rewrite my books 70 or 80 times before I'm done. I couldn't have done that on a manual typewriter.
Mm-hmm.
So I think part of the reason, I like to think my writing has gotten better. That's because I revise them constantly over and over and over and over again. So there.
Sorry about that. Sorry.
Okay. I read somewhere, who was it? Leonardo da Vinci said, no artwork is ever finished. It's abandoned.
Well, everyone, today's interview went really well. Zoom, unfortunately, because I didn't upgrade, it only allowed me for 40 minutes, which is like the base. And that's usually a good chunk of time for me to complete an interview. But I hate it when I don't want to like rush the person. So Avi was in the middle of finishing up a thought, and unfortunately the video cut out. So I did write down the last thing he said. So he actually called me this morning. The technical difficulties, he was having some issues with his computer, trying to get the video to start, and his wife Linda had to come in and help him. So once we got that settled, then we finally got the video up, and yay. So Zoom allows you to have the camera rolling, but once you start recording, it only allowed you 40 minutes unless you decided to upgrade. And I really don't want to have to continue spending, to be honest, but you know what? I'd like to turn this into a home business as part of that. So, but moving on from that, one of the last things he said, because one of the last questions was his typical writing routine, but he was saying from a saying from Leonardo da Vinci, art is never finished, it's just simply abandoned. And once Avi completes a published book, once he's done revising what he thinks is like the best type of quality book, he doesn't like to reread the books that he has written, because oftentimes what he'll find is that sometimes there'll be something in a book that he thinks he should have, oh my gosh, I should have really re-revised that one or rewritten that a little bit differently. So he doesn't do that. But he really enjoyed today's conversation. I thanked him, and this was just a wonderful interview with him, and I'm hoping to hopefully hear back from some more wonderful authors along the way. So we did discuss books that I have read by Avi, and unfortunately I had the wrong book with me at the beginning, and for some reason this time the camera, if I was talking, it didn't cut to me. So I don't know what happened with the camera settings. So the entire time the camera is focused on Avi, which to be honest is totally fine, but you do get to hear my voice. But I did mention the books that I read from him this last month, which was The Seer of Shadows, Don't You Know There's a War On, The School of the Dead, The Book Without Words, which is, I used that book as part of the reading challenge for this year, which I finished, and I literally, Beyond the Western Sea, now I have to read the second one. That book had me on edge, and I did mention in the video that he and Stephen King are the only two authors I've read so far where it mentions that the stories, the chapters, are written in a way with as short chapters, that in Victorian England at the time, that's how stories were published, as very simple, short chapters that would leave a cliffhanger at the end of each one, making readers literally hanging on to the end of each episode. We did discuss Simon Callow, whom he actually got to see in person. I wish I had that same chance. But again, it was a wonderful interview. So Avi, thank you so much for allowing me to interview you, and I'm looking forward to your next story. You mentioned something about Colorado history, so I am looking forward to reading about that. So, thank you to everyone who has watched this video, and I will see you guys again for the next interview, hopefully soon. The book that I'm not sure which book I'm going to read next because I have a bunch of books from the library I do need to finish, and the one I'm currently in the middle of reading right now is The Night Circus. This one, I'm a little bit more interested in reading the remainder of it. So far, I've gotten up to the point, and for anyone else who has read this story, I've gotten to the point where the two main characters are now, I believe at this point, they are about to face each other in some ultimate challenge set up by their predecessors. So we will see what happens with that story. And I will let you guys know as soon as it's finished how I thought of it. And I hope to see you guys again soon. So keep on reading and challenging yourself. This is the year. I'll see you guys later.